All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us for our Bible study this morning. We're going to be finishing up the book of 2 Kings. This is going to be it. We're getting to the end of 2 Kings. And after this, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing a probably 8-part series where we're going to be watching a video series about the Old Testament, the spiritual worldview of the Old Testament. And it's really kind of helpful. So one of the things that we've been talking about, both in this class and in some of our other Bible studies and sermons, is that the worldview of the Old Testament is just different than the New Testament, or not even the New Testament, I mean, than the modern times, yeah.
And it's worldview that time, or are we talking about our current world?
So the worldview of the Old Testament times, the people who lived then, is much different than our worldview.
Right, okay, so
yeah.
we're not looking at it from our point of view, looking back.
Right. We're trying to understand how they thought, yeah. How did they think? Because one of the things that's important to understand, and the guy that we will be watching, he makes this point a lot, is that the Bible wasn't written to us, okay? It was written to the people who originally received the words. And the Bible is for us. I mean, it's for our reading, it's for our edification, but it wasn't written to us. And if you don't understand the mindset and the culture of the people who originally received it, then you won't really understand the ideas behind it. And a lot of stuff won't make sense. And so what we're going to be doing is we'll be doing this 8-part series. And what we'll do is we'll watch kind of half of the presentation and then have some discussion. His presentations are they're almost like an hour and 20 minutes long. And so if we kind of take half of that and do a little bit of discussion, that should be a full class for us. So it's a 4-part series that will stretch out into 8. But we'll be going over this, and I think you guys will find it really helpful because it will actually explain a lot of the weird things that happen in the Old Testament and a lot of the weird things that happen when Jesus is doing his ministry. So, you know, the stuff about demons, the stuff about locations, geography. A great one is, do you guys remember there was an official from Damascus, and he had leprosy, and remember, we covered this in 1 Kings. He went and dipped himself in the Jordan, and he was healed. Do you guys remember that story? And if you recall what he wants, he asked this from the prophet, as he said, can I load down a camel with dirt and take it home? Now to us that sounds like a weird thing to ask for, but it makes sense from the standpoint of the Old Testament spiritual worldview. There's a thing that we'll get into, it's kind of a spiritual geography thing, where geographical boundaries have much more significance to them than it did for us, and there's a reason for that. And so we'll get into stuff like, you know, angels and demons and what were those things and why do they have the prominence in the scriptures that they have. We'll get into things like the rebellions that happen in the Bible. There's actually multiple rebellions. It's not just the fall. The fall is one of them, but there's multiple rebellions. We'll talk about, well, where does Satan come from? And, you know, we'll talk about spiritual warfare and those kinds of things. But that will actually, I think, inform us and help us to understand kind of why this is such a big deal. So what we're covering today is kind of the end of Israel existing as the nation that they were. Now, they will come back from captivity, but they're going to come back from captivity as a different nation. And when they come back from captivity, there's also going to be a problem because there will be people that were moved into this area from other places. So what happens in this day and age, when you conquered a nation, geography was a really big deal. And so they would fight for their country. But if you took them out of that country and put them in a new country, they were much less likely to fight for that new place. And so that's what these guys would do, is they would take the inhabitants out of one place, especially, now you couldn't move everybody, and so they would often leave some of the very poor people, but all the influential people, the leaders, the governors, the craftsmen, the people who were really valuable, they would take them out of the land and put them someplace else, and they would bring new people and put them in this land. So that actually takes place, and when you see Jesus come on the scene, remember how the Samaritans are hated in Jesus' day? Well, the reason that they're hated is because they are a mixture of people that are from foreign lands and the few remaining Jewish people that stayed behind. They're a mixture of those people. And so for the people who come back and are kind of full-blooded Jews, they look at those people as, you guys aren't like us. You're not us. And along with that intermixture comes an intermixture of religious ideas. And so they come back, and not only are they now ethnically different from those people, but religiously there's significant differences because they've mixed in foreign gods into their idea of worship. Right? So all this stuff kind of plays into when Jesus is going to be doing his ministry. All this, the Israel that exists before this event and the Israel that exists after it are completely different. And we just have to understand that that's the way that it works here. Okay? So what we'll do is we'll finish up today. We'll see the end of this take place. And then next week we'll start on to this idea of the Old Testament and the Old Testament worldview, spiritual geography, all that kind of stuff. All right? So let's go ahead and get started. We're in chapter 24, verse 18. And most of the stuff that's really important has kind of happened. Remember last week we talked about how there's been this kind of first captivity, and there's been a capture of a lot of the articles from the tabernacle or the temple. Do you guys remember that from last week? So the temple stuff, a lot of it's been carried away, and that's a big deal. So why is it a big deal for stuff from the temple to be carried off to a foreign country, foreign nation? If you're an Israelite, why do you care? Why do you care that some dishes and stuff that in the temple that you've never probably even seen has been carried away? Why is that a big deal for you as an Israelite?
They weren't just dishes.
Okay.
They were holy things.
Okay, so what does it mean for something to be holy? Do you remember we talked about it? It's sanctified, it's set apart. And it's set apart for God's purpose. And this actually becomes really important. We're going to talk about that in our sermon series today. So in our view, words are not that big of a deal. In our modern mindset, words don't really matter that much. So one of the things that's... Right. Yeah. They do. Well, it depends. It depends. So one of the things that's interesting is that, yeah, you can get in trouble for words very easily now, but one of the things that's really interesting is, I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but when people make plans now, they're not the way that they were like when we were younger. So one of the things that's fascinating to me is a lot of young people now will make plans with each other and then never show up and never text and never do anything like that. That happens a lot now. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it happens all of the time. In fact, I would say that in some groups that if you make plans with a friend, there's less than a 50% chance that it'll actually take place. And most of the time there will not be any acknowledgement. It'll just be like a no-show.
It's not true. You're young.
Yeah, that's how I know. That's because I've seen it. I see it happen.
I had no idea.
I had no idea that was the way it was too.
Individuals that are my age that do that to me from time to time, but not,
Right.
not as a general rule. Do you think?
Yeah, so she said,
What?
So you're talking about the wider culture.
yeah, I'm talking about the wider culture. So she was just saying that to her, this is, when she grew up with this being normal.
Well, it's normal for me to, the day before, an hour before, say, are we still on? Because if you don't
You
confirm.
don't check it, you end up
Yeah.
getting out there.
Everything's just really up in the air. And when you make a plan, it doesn't really mean, see, when I was growing up, when you made a plan, that was it. And if you did cancel, there was profuse apologies, and I'm really sorry, and but that's not the way that it is anymore. And so,
With the younger kids, because I think with the older people that happen, I mean, I get calls or texts or whatever, maybe
Right.
last minute sometimes, but usually it's not just a no-show.
Right.
So I think, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
The younger ones that are coming.
yeah, they've come up with a completely different world than we have. So we grew up with these words being super important, and this is an aspect of it. So think about it this way. When something is holy, God has said, that's mine. That's what it means. God said, that's mine. And when God says, that's mine, that you don't handle that flippantly. You don't say, oh, okay, well, I'll just borrow it when I feel like it. No, that's God's. And that idea of ownership. One of the things that's fascinating is we've been buying some motorcycles and stuff recently, and when you do that, there's a title. And the interesting thing is to think about, does a title transfer ownership, or does it record a transfer of ownership? You see what I'm saying? The two different things. In one instance, it's just making a record of something that's previously already happened. In the other, it's actually making it happen. Now, I think in a modern view, we look at it as that affects the transfer of ownership. But in a more ancient view, the transfer of ownership happens with a word, and that's just the recording of it already taking place. It's the word that's important. And so outside there, you guys all have your cars. That car is yours. Well, what makes it yours? There's actually just a word makes it yours, because it can become somebody else's based on a word. But until that word happens, it's still yours. Now, we can argue about whether the title transfer is the recording of the event or the actual event itself, but it's either a written word or it's a spoken word that makes it yours or makes it somebody else's. And so we still have this kind of idea that something, the status of something changes based on something that has no real, it has no real existence. It's a spiritual thing. I don't know if you guys have recently bought or sold a vehicle, but now the state of Arizona is doing online-only titles. Do you guys know this? They don't give you a physical copy of the title anymore. It's just recorded in the cloud. It's recorded in space and the internet. And they don't. You can get one, but you have to pay $4 and have it sent to you. So you can still get a paper title, but they're trying to actually discourage you from doing that.
Well, you mentioned you couldn't show your title because you couldn't get it, whatever. So when you
Yeah.
stop by the police, how do you show your title then?
So so the thing is you have a portal to their website that you're supposed to get now that has access to all that stuff. Exactly. That was my thought exactly. One more thing to keep track of. What's that?
Everybody knows your business.
Yeah. And so the interesting thing
They
is,
should be able to check that themselves then, if they're gonna stop you, let them do it.
yeah, exactly. You want my registration driver's license? You have it online, So, but the interesting thing is, so now it's very fascinating because the recording of it now doesn't even happen on a piece of paper. It happens in something that doesn't exist, but we count that as having a real existence. And that's the way that we have to look at this, is that when these articles from the temple, when they get taken off into captivity, that is things that belong to God Himself being taken into captivity. And if you think God is real and you think His Word means something, this is a really big deal. And it's a big deal for Israel that this has happened. Okay, so that's what happened last week, is that, and a lot of other people got taken into captivity. Kind of the most important people got taken into captivity. But Israel will kind of now continue, or Judah will continue as a vassal state now of Babylon. A vassal state is when it's kind of like, when we took over Iraq and we said, we're going to appoint a governor to take care of Iraq. That's basically what happened here, is that there's now a king here, but he's under the thumb of Babylon, and if he doesn't do what Babylon wants, bad things are going to happen. He can rule, but basically in name only. He has to only do what Babylon wants done. Okay, so that's where we'll pick up the story. So we'll be in 2 Kings 24, verse 18.
Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. For because of the anger of the Lord, it came to the point in Jerusalem and Judah that he cast them out from his presence. And Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. You want me to go into 25?
Yes.
And in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, and on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came with all his army against Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And they built siege works all around it. So the city was besieged till the 11th year of King Zedekiah. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. Then a breach was made in the city, and all the men of war fled by night by the way of the gate between the two walls, by the king's garden, and the Chaldeans were around the city. And they went in the direction of the Arabah. And the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho, and all his army was scattered from him. Then they captured the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon at Riblah, and they passed sentence on him. They slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and bound him in chains, and took him to Babylon.
Okay, we'll stop there. Okay, so Zedekiah has decided that, hey, I don't have to listen to this guy. And so he decides to rebel against him. Now, here's the thing. Wars start when weak countries think that they're stronger than they are, and they perceive that stronger countries are weaker than they are. And so somehow this guy's gotten the idea that, hey, what happened just earlier is not going to happen to me, and he decides that he's going to rebel. And it says God is going to cast them out of his presence. If you look at verse 20, for because of the anger of the Lord, it came to the point in Jerusalem and Judah that he cast them out from his presence. It's important to understand here that the temple was just a picture of the nation. Remember, we talked about this idea earlier, is that the temple is actually just a building that represents God's presence within the nation of Israel. Because remember that in Psalms it says that God inhabits the praises of his people, that God is present in the praises of his people. The idea is that Israel really is the temple, and that God is present with them. And so when things get carried out of the physical temple, it's just a picture, a symbol of a larger thing that's happening, which is God is saying, hey, this is not my people anymore. This is not my place. This is not where I dwell anymore. And God, there's two ways of looking at it. One is that God kind of gets up and leaves, and the other one is that God says, I'm staying, you guys can leave. And he casts them out of his presence. Now, the reason that's important, and I'll give you guys a little preview of some of the things that we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks, is that in the Bible, there's this idea of spiritual geography where gods have power over certain countries. Okay, so for instance, in Daniel, it talks about there was an angel that was going to come to Daniel, but he was delayed by the prince of Persia. You guys might be familiar with that passage. The interesting thing is, well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean an angel's not going to be delayed by an actual physical prince. It's talking about a spiritual entity that's over Persia that's delaying this angel from getting there. And so there's the idea in the Old Testament is that what happens is there's a rebellion that takes place. And we'll kind of go through this and give you guys kind of the big picture of what we'll be covering the next few weeks, and then we'll get into the more detail as we go through. But if you want to turn your Bibles and go all the way back, we can go to Genesis chapter 3. And when we think about a spiritual rebellion, we generally think about the fall of Adam and Eve, right? And remember that in verse 4 it says, the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. Remember? He's contradicting what God says. You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And so the serpent, Satan, is contradicting God. So he's in rebellion against God. And when Adam and Eve believe him, they now are in rebellion against God as well, right? So now there's a spiritual rebellion against God, and there's a physical rebellion against God. Now, the thing that's important to understand is that doesn't really fully explain why the world is the way it is. In order to do that, we have to go further. And so if you go to chapter 6, okay, go to chapter 6 of Genesis, and it talks about the increase of corruption on the earth. How did the world get to the point that it was so bad that God will decide to destroy it in a flood? Well, let's read chapter 6, verse 1. It says, when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and the daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any that they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall number 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men that were of old, men of renown. The Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intention and thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So this is a strange passage, and there's a couple of different interpretations of this passage. Okay, so we have this idea that there's sons of God and daughters of man that are intermarrying. And the question is, well, what does that mean? The two major ways that Bible scholars interpret this is, the first one is that the sons of God are descendants of godliness, basically. They're the good guys, okay? And we can go back to understand this a little bit. We can go back and we can understand that Noah has sons, right? He's got Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And what's going to happen is that some of these sons will turn out good and some of them will turn out bad, and they're having kids and they're having descendants. And remember, this is back when people lived a long time. You know, if you look at the chapter 5, it has like Methuselah, who lived 969 years. And so you're going to have a ton of descendants, right? So the idea is that these characters have descendants already, and some of them are good and some of them are bad, and that the good ones found the daughters of the bad ones attractive, and so they had kids with them, and then that was a bad deal. So that's one interpretation, okay? The other interpretation is much, much different, okay? That is that, remember we talked about in our sermon last week that this idea of sons of God appears to be the idea of a heavenly council. God has made other beings, other spiritual beings, to do things for him. And that they are part of a divine, or not divine in the sense that they're all God, but divine, or maybe we should say this differently. They're part of a spiritual family that's not embodied, and they carry out things. And part of the reason for this is that the Bible is very clear that heaven is the pattern for earth. And so if you have things like kings, and you have things like hierarchies on earth, and you have things like families on earth, that those are probably things that reflect heaven, because that theme of everything on earth needing to be like things in heaven happens over and over and over again in the Bible. So the idea of sons of God is that these are part of a heavenly council. These are spiritual beings that carry out the will of God. So under that idea, then what this means is that some of those creatures have rebelled, and that they have then married daughters of men, and that they've had children. And that God sees this as a really big deal, like a really big problem. Now, this is something that a lot of the old Jewish scholars wrote about. This is the view, if you were in Jesus' day, if you were walking around in Jesus' day, the people that Jesus is speaking to, that's what they believe happened here. Okay, they don't believe that this was different descendants of Noah. Some were good and some were bad and they intermarried. They believed that these were spiritual beings that then had offspring with people. And before you say, well, that's a really strange, weird idea, I agree, it's strange and weird. But here's the thing. There's a precedent for that. Can you guys think of what the precedent is? And by precedent, I should say, there's a precedent in our knowledge, not something that preceded this event, but something that we know of that would lend credence to the ability for this to happen.
Well, there are times that angels came to heaven and looked like men.
Right. So you have that.
They could have a physical-
Right. And so they have meals and stuff like that, so they could have a physical presence. But what else? Yeah. Yeah. So remember that God has, Christ is the offspring of not Mary and Joseph, but Mary and God. Now, obviously, there's not a sexual union there, but the idea that a spiritual force can make an offspring with that's, we already know that can happen. You know, we believe that can happen. So the idea of this doesn't become so strange then. Now, again, I'm trying to tell you how that they believed back in Jesus' day and age. That could be accurate, it could be not accurate. That's for you to decide whether you find the evidence compelling or not. Okay, so the idea that they had behind this is, right after this you hear about Noah and you hear about how terrible things are on the earth. The ancient Jews of like Jesus' day and before, they actually believed that these spiritual beings and the offspring that they made were instrumental in teaching man how to be evil. That they taught him arts of war. They taught him things about like drugs and alcohol and all these kinds of ways that you can basically destroy yourself, that they were instrumental in teaching man to do that. And that's why there was an increasing corruption on the earth, and this was actually the beginning of that increasing corruption on the earth. All right, so that's what the ancient Jews believed. So when we're later on, when we're going to look at Jesus and some of the things that happened with him, it's important to understand that when he's communicating with his audience, that's the background. They would believe this, okay? So after that, you have Noah and the flood, okay? That happens, and remember that there's a new covenant after that. And God makes this new covenant in chapter 9. And remember, there's a new covenant with Noah, and he's supposed to go ahead and then do the same thing that he was originally supposed to do, fill the earth, subdue it, make lots of people so that they could, rule in the image of God. That the whole thing is supposed to happen. That's still the goal. And also remember that now they have authority over the animals, to take the life of animals and to even carry out the death sentence upon men for certain things. That's what's happened here. And then in chapter 10, you get this table of nations that has descended from Noah, and there's 70 nations, and that's going to be important. 70 to 72, depending on which translation you look at. So some will say 70 and some will say 72. Interestingly, when Jesus sends out, remember he sends out the 12, but then another time he sends out 70 or 72, depending on which translation you look at or which version. The reason that number is significant is because it goes back to this idea of the table of nations. Also in the Feast of Booths, they'll sacrifice 70 bulls at the end of that feast. That also comes back to this. Okay, after that is a really important event happens. So if you look at Genesis chapter 11, this is the Tower of Babel. Now the Tower of Babel ends up being incredibly important for us. Okay, so let's go ahead and read that, and we need to understand exactly what's happening here, because more is going on than meets the eye for us. Chapter 11 says, "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. They said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.' And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, 'Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they shall do. And nothing that they proposed to do will now be impossible for them.'" Now, what's the problem here? There's a couple of them. The first one is, remember, God said they're supposed to go scatter over the earth so that they can subdue the whole earth. And they're not. They're congregating in one place. The other one is when it says that they have one language, it's important to understand what that means. It means that they have one confession. And that one confession means that they have one religion. They have one faith. When it talks about language here, the actual Hebrew word is the word for lip. And remember when Isaiah says, "I am a man of unclean lips"? It's actually not he doesn't say that he needs a napkin, right? That's not what he's saying. He's saying that his confession or his religion is unclean. And that's what's at issue here, is that there's one religion here. There's one, and they're building basically, when they say we'll build a tower to the sky, they're basically saying we're going to go up and reach the gods, and it'll be us, it'll be on our terms, it'll be our doing, and it'll make a name for us. It will glorify us. So God is not going to allow this to stand. This is, again, another rebellion that's taking place. And now this rebellion ends up being really important. So what's the result of this? What does God do to thwart this plan? Do you guys remember?
Confuses the language.
He confuses their language, right? Yeah. And so now it does have the effect of differentiating the languages, but you understand when you talk about a language is more than just different words. You know what I'm saying? Like if you go to translate something, there are some things that you go, There's not really a word in English for that. Why is that? Well, because it's actually a way of thinking, right? And that way of thinking ultimately has its roots in how you view the world. It's ultimately religious. It's ultimately spiritual. And so they do have different languages, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing here is that they have different confessions. They have different religions. They have different ways of looking at those things. Now, it actually is more even important than that. So let's go to the book of Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is important for what reason? What is the book of Deuteronomy about? Right, very good. So if you go to chapter 32, and let's go ahead and start in verse 7. So this is a song of Moses, and he's kind of recounting some of the acts of God here. And he says, "Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is his allotted heritage." So, interestingly enough, if you look at number 2, well, in my Bible it's number 2. Do you guys have a number after sons of God?
From verse 8.
From verse 8, yes. Okay, so some of you might have a little note at the bottom of the page of your Bible, and there'll be a little number there. And if you look at the number and go down and you look at number, in my Bible, number 2, it says, "Compare Dead Sea Scroll, Septuagint, Masoretic text, sons of Israel." So here's the deal. If you look at some Bibles,
Mine says sons of Adam.
sons of Adam, okay. So some Bibles will say sons of Israel or sons of Adam. Other will say sons of God. Now, why is that? It's because in I think it was 1940s and 1950s, they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. 47, I think. And then they started unearthing them, they started studying them. And the oldest copies that they have of a lot of the Old Testament books come from the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you have an older translation of the Bible, it won't contain any of the information from the Dead Sea Scrolls because they weren't discovered yet. If you have a newer translation, then they've looked at the Dead Sea Scrolls and they've made some determinations on how to translate certain words. The Dead Sea Scrolls have, in this passage, the sons of God, not the sons of Israel or sons of Adam. The older ones that they had previously, which are actually newer, if that makes sense, have sons of Adam or sons of Israel, but the Dead Sea Scrolls, which they found most recently but are actually oldest, have sons of God. Now, this becomes important. And the reason it becomes important is the idea here is that when God confused the languages of the people, he set over all the different nations one of the sons of God, one of these spiritual beings. And rather than lead them into truth and lead them towards God, what these spiritual beings did is they led them toward worship of themselves. So remember, we covered last week that passage where God was actually declaring his judgment of the sons of God. Do you guys remember that? Where he was saying, you have not brought justice, you have not shown mercy, you have not done these things, and so even though you are like gods, you will die like men. And that's actually the idea here is that back in this day and age, so if you lived back then, you believed that as a people you had your own God. The idea is that this belief came from the fact that you had a spiritual being that was over you as a people, that was over this nation. And that spiritual being was supposed to guide you toward God, but it didn't guide you toward God. It guided you toward itself. It guided you toward whatever it wanted. There's more cosmic rebellion going on here. Okay? And these things are leading people astray. These beings are leading people astray. And each of the nations has one of these. The idea being that God eventually said, hey, these things are not leading people back to me. They're leading people in the completely wrong way. I'm going to judge them. And the way that I'm going to start this judgment is I'm going to find a person whose name is Abram, and I'm going to take him and I'm going to develop a people for myself. Now, this people that he's developing for himself, it's going to be important to God that it doesn't come from a natural place. So remember, Abraham has no offspring, and he's 100 years old. So that this nation becomes the miraculous work of God, and that he is going to make them his God, and he is going to be their people, and he's going to lead them to a land, and he's going to be a God of that land and that people, and their job is to be a light to the nations, a priesthood to the nations, to lead people away from those spiritual beings that they're worshiping and towards God. That's what's supposed to happen. So when God, and now we can go back to our story.
That's a real quick question.
Sure.
When you talk, there's a revelation where they talk about the wiping away, the half of heaven fell with Satan or whatever.
Yeah.
Are these the beings they're kind of talking about?
Yeah, so the idea would be, and we'll get to some of that when we go into this the next few weeks, is that when Jesus rises from the dead, that it basically throws a lot of these spiritual beings out of the presence of God. Because remember
It
that,
doesn't happen until then.
right, well, so here's the thing that's interesting, is that remember that when Job, the book of Job, Satan comes into the presence of God, and they're having a conversation. Well, the idea is that once Jesus rises from the dead, that Satan doesn't get to do that anymore. And Satan's not, free to just bebop around the world anymore and do whatever he's doing, That all kind of ends there. And so we'll get into some more of that later. Now, again, if you don't find, as we go through this, if you don't find this compelling, it's not like, we're going to burn anybody at the stake for this, and I don't think I would burn at the stake for this. So, but it helps to explain a lot of things that are in the Bible that don't make sense. So as an example, when Jesus talks about shaking the dust off your feet and doing those kinds of things, or this guy in Kings that wants to bring this land back to probably spread around his house, he wants to live in Israel because he wants to have the God of Israel. And this is the mindset that they had back then. And so the point about this is this. What's going to happen now is that Israel is going to be taken into captivity. And the king is dead, and Israel is going to be taken off. Most of the remaining people are going to be taken off into Babylon. This represents God saying, okay, you guys have wanted to follow these foreign gods. You've wanted to follow the gods that were here before me. I've made you my special people. You are the ones who are supposed to be following me. And even the conquest of Canaan and all that kind of stuff makes sense in this Old Testament mindset and worldview. And now God is saying, okay, you guys won't choose me. You won't honor me. You won't make me your God. I'm done with you, right? I'm done with you. And now he's not done with them forever. And what we'll see is when Jesus comes on the scene, a lot of the stuff that Jesus does kind of plays back into this. In fact, when you see, a lot of the times when you see people who are possessed by demons, when Jesus is ministering, most of them come from Gentile areas. Okay, and a lot of these things will start making more sense because of the mindset that they had back then. But what's happening here is God is basically saying, I'm done with you guys. And it's going to be 70 years before they can, come back, right? And things are going to be completely different then. So let's go ahead and finish this up. In the last few minutes we have, let's just read through the rest of the text and be done. I know it's quite a bit of reading to take in at one time, but this way we know we've covered it.
In the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, that was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the bodyguard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he burned the house of the Lord, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned down, And all the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls of around Jerusalem, and the rest of the people who were left in the city, and the deserters who had deserted to the king of Babylon, together with the rest of the multitude, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried into exile. But the captain of the guard left some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen. And the pillars of bronze that were in the house of the Lord, and the stands and the bronze sea that were in the house of the Lord, the Chaldeans broke in pieces and carried the bronze to Babylon. And they took away the pots and the shovels and the snuffers and the dishes for incense and all the vessels of bronze used in the temple service, the fire pans also and the bowls. What was of gold, the captain of the guard took away as gold, and what was of silver as silver. As for the 2 pillars, the one sea and the stands that Solomon had made for the house of the Lord, the bronze of all these vessels was beyond weight. The height of the one pillar was 18 cubits, and on it was a capital of bronze. The height of the capital was 3 cubits. A latticework and pomegranates, all of bronze, were all around the capital, and the second pillar had the same, with the latticework. And the captain of the guard took Sariah the chief priest, and Zephaniah the second priest, and the 3 keepers of the threshold. And from the city he took an officer who had been in command of the men of war, and 5 men of the king's council who were found in the city, and the secretary of the commander of the army, who mustered the people of the land, and 60 men of the people of the land, who were found in the city. And Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, took them and brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah. And the king of Babylon struck them down and put them to death at Riblah in the land of Hamath. So Judah was taken into exile out of its land. And over the people who remained in the land of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had left, he appointed Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, son of Shaphan, governor. Now when all the captains and their men heard that the king of Babylon had appointed Gedaliah governor, they came with their men to Gedaliah at Mizpah, namely Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, and Jehohanan, the son of Kareah, and Sariah, the son of Tanhumeth, the Netophalah,
Just go to 24.
Okay. And Gedaliah swore to them and their men, saying, "Do not be afraid because of the Chaldean officials. Live in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it shall be well with you." But in the 7th month, Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, son of Elishama, of the royal family, came with 10 men and struck down Gedaliah and put him to death, along with the Jews and the Chaldeans who were with him at Mizpah. Then all the people, both small and great, and the captains of the forces arose and went to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans. And in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. And he spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim put off his prison garments, and every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king, according to his daily needs, as long as he lived.
All right, so there it ends. And so we will see, as we continue on for the next few weeks, kind of what the meaning of this from a spiritual standpoint is, and we'll get kind of the background view of this. And then we'll talk about the intertestamental period after that and kind of continue on with the story. All right, so that's that. Thanks for joining us. Let's pray, and then we'll be done. Father, we thank you for this day. Thank you for the blessings you've given us. We thank you for your word and what we can learn from it. We ask that you'd help us to be good students so that we might be wise and discerning. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. We'll see you guys next week.